Welcome back to Life's Chillment. My name is Avital, and this week's Parshat is Parshat Bo, which is a really exciting Parsha because it is the final moments of the Jewish people being enslaved in Egypt. After this Parsha, they sort of become free people. They get to leave Egypt and the Exodus story and all of these exciting things that are coming up from them all the way to the end of the Torah, where they are at the precipice of entering the land of Israel. And so it's a really exciting turning point in the Parsha where they had just spent hundreds of years enslaved, and now they are going to be transitioning to free people. And as part of this transition, God tells the Jewish people to observe the holiday that we now know as Passover. He tells us that every year we are supposed to remember the sort of exodus from Egypt, and one of the ways that we're supposed to do this is by eating matzah, and eating unleavened cakes, unleavened bread as it's referred to in the Torah. And that's one of the things that we gain that has endured from the time of the Torah all the way until today. If you think about Passover, you're probably thinking about matzah, and most people don't have the best feelings towards matzah and its taste, but it's actually a really powerful symbolic food. We learn about matzah after the death of the firstborn males in Egypt. The last of the 10 plagues is the death of the firstborns, and all of the firstborn men in Egypt died, and all the firstborn animals, and all of those things. And as such, the Egyptians were now naturally scared, and they wanted the Jewish people to just leave already. Because as they say in the Torah, everybody's dying, basically. The Egyptians were saying that everybody was dying. They saw that it was directly related to the Jews, and so they wanted the Jews to leave as quickly as possible. And so we hear about matzah because it's said that the Jewish people, they didn't have time for their bread to rise. What it says is the people picked up their dough when it was not yet leavened, their leftovers bound in their garments on their shoulders. So they didn't have time, they weren't able to make the bread that they initially considered. And if you've had matzah before, you know that it's no bread. It is no substitute for bread. It is not the same thing. It doesn't taste the same. It's not that same fresh, delicious dough. It's sort of like a cracker. And the people, they didn't have time for their bread to rise, and so therefore we had matzah. Interestingly, the Torah also tells us about matzah that remember this day when you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for with a mighty hand the Lord took you out of here, and therefore no leaven shall be eaten. And so that's, again, the idea that we shouldn't eat leaven, we should eat matzah as a way of remembering that God took us out of the land of Egypt. And not just that we shouldn't eat leaven, but we can't even possess it. We can't even have anything that is leavened within our households during Passover. So that's pretty impressive. It's a pretty big statement, and again, it's about something that seems like a small detail within the Torah. Like in the grand scheme of things, in the great story of the Exodus, matzah seems like a small detail. And yet here it was given to us in the Torah more than one time that we should eat unleavened cakes. And not only that, but it's something that we are still doing to this day. When we read this in the Torah, when we read about this quote-unquote failed attempt at making bread, why is that so important that it's something that we are still observing to this day? What is the lesson there? So I would argue that it is a beautiful lesson in imperfections. Matzah was something where the goal was to make bread. The goal was for them to have bread to eat. And yet, because of the Egyptians rushing them out, because of that influence of them not having time to just sit and have the luxury of actually letting the bread rise and being able to bake the bread like that, they came out with matzah. That was what the end thing was. And I think it's a perfect, we read this Parsha right around New Year's. We read this Parsha just when people in the secular world at least, or really all over, are making these resolutions for what they want to do in the new year. And they have these grand ideas and these great goals of what it's going to end up being. And yet, more often than not, we fall short. More often than not, we have these great goals with great intentions, and we're not able to get there. We sort of end up with the matzah version. We end up with we're striving for bread, and we reached matzah. We didn't make nothing, but we didn't end up with what we wanted to make. And I think it's so beautiful that this Parsha falls out around the new year because it's such a great lesson. We take what the intention was, we take that making bread, and we say, I couldn't make bread because we were getting forced out of Egypt by the Egyptians. We didn't have time. I had all the right intentions, but it just didn't come to pass. It just wasn't a possibility. And we should do the same thing with, rather than being hard on themselves for, not starting sooner or for not having the proper time they wanted, we annually recognize why it was that they weren't able to make the bread that they set out to make. Similarly with our goals, we should be able to say, my goal was to do X, Y, or Z, and because of all of these influences that came up in the year that I wasn't expecting, that I wasn't anticipating, I wasn't able to achieve it. But it doesn't mean that I didn't achieve something great, and it doesn't mean that I didn't achieve something worth remembering, and it doesn't mean that I didn't try. And our effort is so important. Our effort is something worth remembering, worth recognizing, worth taking note of. And so I think that's really something beautiful that we can learn from the story of the matzah, is that just because it wasn't what you wanted it to be, doesn't mean that it wasn't something great in and of itself. And so with that in mind, I hope you all have a very happy New Year, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom and a great week ahead.